The most dangerous family secrets are never the ones people hide from strangers. They are the ones hidden from the people who deserve the truth the most. I believed our family reunion would be one of the happiest weekends we had shared in years. At 67 years old, I had learned not to take those gatherings for granted. Families grow busy. Children move away. Grandchildren become teenagers with their own schedules. Life has a way of pulling people in different directions. That was why I had spent nearly 6 months helping organize the Collins family reunion. For the first time in almost 8 years, relatives from across the country were coming together at a large lakeside lodge in northern Michigan. Some family members were driving hundreds of miles. Others were flying in from different states. Everyone seemed excited, including me. My name is Margaret Collins, and after losing my husband 5 years earlier, family had become the center of my world. I looked forward to these gatherings because they reminded me that even though life changes, some connections remain. On the morning of the reunion, I arrived at the lodge just after 8 o'clock. The weather could not have been more perfect. The lake sparkled beneath bright summer sunlight. Children were already running across the grass while adults unloaded coolers, folding chairs, and picnic supplies. Laughter echoed through the air. For a few moments I simply stood there taking everything in. Felt good. Felt familiar. Felt like home. My son Daniel was one of the first people to greet me. He wrapped me in a hug and asked if I needed help carrying anything. Behind him stood his wife, Jennifer. She smiled warmly and immediately offered to help with my bags. At first, nothing seemed unusual. In fact, Jennifer appeared friendlier than I had seen her in years. She complimented my dress. She asked about my drive. She even insisted on bringing me a glass of iced tea before I had finished unpacking. If someone had met her that morning, they would have assumed we shared a wonderful relationship. The truth was more complicated. Jennifer and I had never openly argued. There had never been screaming, matches, or dramatic confrontations. Yet there had always been a certain distance between us. We were polite, respectful, careful, but never especially close. That was why her sudden enthusiasm caught my attention. Not because it was unpleasant, because it felt unexpected. Throughout the morning, I noticed her constantly checking on me. She asked whether I was comfortable. She offered me food. She introduced me to relatives I had known for decades, as though I were a guest of honor. Several family members even commented on how attentive she seemed. I smiled and accepted the kindness. Still, something about it felt unusual. Around lunchtime, the reunion officially began. Long picnic tables stretched beneath large tents overlooking the lake. Nearly 60 relatives attended. Some I had not seen since before my husband passed away. Others were children the last time we met and now stood taller than their parents. Stories filled the air. Memories were shared. Old photographs circulated from table to table. As the afternoon continued, I found myself relaxing. Maybe I had been imagining things. Maybe Jennifer was simply making an effort to strengthen our relationship. The possibility genuinely pleased me. Family matters more as you get older. Petty misunderstandings become less important. At least that is what I believed. Later in the day, while several relatives gathered near a display of old family photographs, I noticed something that gave me pause. Jennifer quickly removed one particular envelope from the display table and slipped it into her purse. The action happened so fast that I almost doubted what I had seen. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it contained private information. Yet the look on her face lingered in my mind. It was not embarrassment. It was concern. A few minutes later, she noticed me watching. Her smile returned immediately. "Everything okay?" she asked cheerfully. "Of course," I replied. She nodded and walked away. The moment lasted only seconds. Still, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. That evening, as families gathered around outdoor fire pits and children roasted marshmallows beside the lake, I found myself replaying the incident. Why had Jennifer removed the envelope so quickly? Why had she looked worried? And why did I suddenly feel as though there was something important happening just beneath the surface of what should have been a simple family reunion? I tried pushing the thought aside. After all, the weekend had only just begun. What I did not know was that before the reunion ended, a secret hidden for years would come into the open, and nothing in our family would ever look quite the same again. The next morning began quietly. Sunlight stretched across the lake, turning the water into a sheet of gold. Most of the younger children were already outside playing while the adults gathered around folding tables for breakfast. From a distance, everything looked exactly as a family reunion should. People laughed. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Relatives exchanged stories about old vacations and family traditions. Yet despite the cheerful atmosphere, I could not stop thinking about the envelope Jennifer had removed the day before. I told myself it was none of my business. Families function best when people resist the urge to create problems where none exist. At 67, I had learned that lesson many times. Still, every time I saw Jennifer, I noticed something unusual. She seemed almost too attentive. If I stood up, she immediately asked whether I needed help. If I joined a conversation, she found a reason to appear nearby. It was as though she wanted to make absolutely certain I remained comfortable and happy. Most people would have considered that a wonderful thing. Yet because it was so different from her usual behavior, it only increased my curiosity. Around mid-morning, several relatives gathered inside the lodge's main hall where old family memorabilia had been arranged on display tables. There were photographs dating back nearly 70 years, military records, wedding albums, handwritten recipes, and letters preserved by previous generations. The exhibit had become one of the most popular attractions of the reunion. Everyone enjoyed looking through pieces of family history. I joined a group near the center of the room where my cousin Patricia was sharing stories about our grandparents. While listening, I noticed Jennifer standing at the far end of the display area. She appeared to be searching for something. Every few moments she glanced over her shoulder. Then she opened her purse and quickly looked inside before closing it again. The behavior lasted only seconds, but it felt strangely secretive. Before I could think much about it, Patricia called my name. "Margaret, do you remember this photograph?" She handed me a faded picture taken nearly 40 years earlier. The image showed my husband, my children, and several relatives during a 4th of July picnic. Looking at it brought back a flood of memories. For several minutes, I forgot about Jennifer entirely. Then something unexpected happened. One of my younger cousins picked up a family timeline that had been prepared for the reunion. It contained major events from the Collins family history: births, marriages, graduations, business milestones. As people reviewed the timeline, casual conversation filled the room. Then my cousin pointed toward one section and laughed. "Wait a second. This cannot be right." Several people gathered closer. "What is wrong?" someone asked. My cousin shrugged. "Nothing serious. The dates are just confusing." The comment seemed harmless, but I noticed Jennifer immediately turned toward the group. Her smile disappeared. She crossed the room faster than seemed necessary and gently took the timeline from my cousin's hands. "Some of the information was difficult to verify," she said quickly. "There might be a few mistakes." Her explanation sounded reasonable, yet the reaction felt excessive. Most people would have laughed and moved on. Jennifer seemed genuinely nervous. The room eventually returned to normal conversation, but I noticed several relatives exchanging curious looks. Apparently, I was not the only person who sensed something unusual. Later that afternoon, while helping organize name tags for an evening family activity, I found myself working beside my niece Rebecca. She lowered her voice and asked a question that caught me off guard. "Has Jennifer seemed different to you this weekend?" I hesitated. "Different how?" Rebecca shrugged. "I do not. No, just nervous." The fact that someone else had noticed immediately got my attention. "Why do you ask?" Rebecca glanced around before answering. "Because every time family records or old documents come up, she acts uncomfortable." I said nothing. Neither of us wanted to gossip. Yet her observation matched exactly what I had seen. That evening, the family gathered near the lakeshore for a storytelling event where older relatives shared memories from previous generations. As people took turns speaking, I noticed Jennifer sitting unusually quiet beside Daniel. She smiled when spoken to, but her attention seemed elsewhere. Then just before sunset, I saw something that made my concern grow. Daniel leaned toward her and asked a simple question. I could not hear the words. Jennifer answered immediately. Whatever she said caused him to look confused. Not angry. Not upset. Simply confused. For several seconds they spoke quietly back and forth. Then Jennifer shook her head and changed the subject. Daniel let it go, but the expression on his face lingered. That was the moment I realized this situation might be larger than I originally thought. Because now it was not only Jennifer behaving strangely. Other family members were beginning to notice it too. And somewhere beneath the laughter, photographs, and happy memories, a story was quietly waiting to reveal itself. The third day of the reunion began with a family brunch inside the main lodge. By then, most people had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The children spent their mornings by the lake. The teenagers occupied the game room. The adults drifted between conversations, coffee, and old memories. On the surface, everything remained pleasant. Yet I could feel a subtle tension growing beneath the laughter. It was the same feeling that appears before a summer storm. Nothing obvious. Nothing dramatic. Just a quiet sense that something was changing. Shortly before lunch, several relatives gathered around one of the larger display tables to review additional family records that had been brought in overnight. Some family members had driven from neighboring towns and arrived carrying old scrapbooks, letters, and documents discovered in attics and storage boxes. The collection attracted immediate attention. People love family history, especially when it reveals stories they have never heard before. I joined the group along with Daniel, Rebecca, Patricia, and several cousins. Jennifer stood nearby but remained unusually quiet. One of the displays contained a collection of handwritten notes created by previous generations of the Collins family. Another contained a family tree updated specifically for the reunion. As people compared dates and names, casual conversation filled the room. Then an unexpected comment changed everything. My cousin Harold picked up a folder and laughed softly. "Well, this does not make much sense." Several people looked up. "What is it?" someone asked. Harold pointed toward a page inside the folder. According to this, the ownership transfer happened almost a year earlier than everyone thought. The comment seemed innocent. Most people probably would not have given it a second thought. Yet the reaction it triggered immediately caught my attention. Jennifer's head turned so quickly that several nearby relatives noticed. Her expression tightened for a brief moment before she forced a smile. "There are probably mistakes in some of those records," she said. Harold shrugged. "Maybe." He handed the document to Rebecca. She reviewed it carefully. "Actually, this date appears to match the county filing information." The room grew slightly quieter. Nobody seemed alarmed. People were simply curious. Still, I noticed Jennifer step closer to the table. Daniel looked at her. "What ownership transfer are they talking about?" he asked casually. Jennifer hesitated. The pause lasted only a second, but it felt unusually long. "I am not sure," she replied. Something about the answer immediately felt wrong. Not because she sounded dishonest, because she sounded prepared. As though she had anticipated the question before it was asked. A few minutes later, the conversation moved on. Family members returned to looking through photographs and sharing stories. Yet the moment stayed with me. More importantly, it seemed to stay with Daniel as well. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed him becoming increasingly thoughtful. Several times he appeared ready to ask Jennifer something before changing his mind. Then another strange thing happened. During a discussion about family property and inheritance history, Patricia mentioned a small lakeside parcel that had belonged to my late husband before his passing. The property was not particularly valuable. It was simply a modest piece of land that held sentimental importance for our family. I smiled when she mentioned it because many childhood memories were connected to that place. Then Patricia said something unexpected. "I remember when the transfer paperwork was finalized." I looked at her. "What transfer paperwork?" Patricia frowned. "The paperwork after Robert passed away." "Robert was my husband. You were there, were you not?" Several people turned toward me.
"No," Ian answered slowly.
"I was never involved in any transfer paperwork." The room became quiet. Patricia looked genuinely confused. "That cannot be right." She glanced around the table. I distinctly remember hearing that everything had already been handled. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Jennifer quickly stepped into the conversation. "I think there is some confusion about dates." Her tone remained polite, but the tension in her voice was impossible to miss. Patricia nodded uncertainly. Daniel looked back and forth between us. The confusion on his face returned. What made the moment unsettling was not the disagreement itself. Families often misremember details. The problem was that multiple stories were no longer matching. Different people remembered different versions of the same events. And every time those contradictions surfaced, Jennifer seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Later that evening, while the family prepared for a group photograph near the lake, Rebecca quietly approached me. "Margaret," she said, lowering her voice, "have you noticed that every strange conversation somehow leads back to paperwork?"
Ich zerrte her.
The thought had already crossed my mind. Rebecca continued, "I do not know what it means." Neither did I. Yet for the first time, a possibility began forming that I had previously dismissed. Maybe the secret hidden beneath this reunion was not personal. Maybe it was financial. Maybe it involved something that happened years ago and had remained buried because nobody thought to question it. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees and family members gathered for pictures, I found myself looking toward Jennifer once again. She stood smiling beside Daniel, appearing perfectly calm. By the fourth day of the reunion, the atmosphere had changed in ways that were impossible to ignore. Nobody was openly discussing secrets or accusations. No arguments had erupted. Yet small conversations kept ending with the same puzzled expressions. People would compare memories, mention old family events, or discuss property records, and sooner or later someone would discover another inconsistency. Each contradiction seemed minor by itself. Together, however, they were beginning to form a pattern. That morning, the family gathered inside the lodge for a presentation prepared by several younger relatives. They had spent months creating a digital history of the Collins family, complete with photographs, timelines, property records, and stories collected from older generations. The project had become one of the highlights of the reunion. Everyone settled into folding chairs while a large screen displayed images from decades past. Laughter filled the room as childhood photographs appeared. Stories were shared. Memories resurfaced. For a while, the weekend felt normal again. Then the presentation reached a section covering the years after my husband Robert passed away. I felt a familiar ache in my chest. Losing him had been the hardest experience of my life. The room grew quieter as family members respectfully listened. Several slides displayed documents connected to family property and estate matters. Most people paid little attention. Legal paperwork rarely creates excitement. Then a young cousin operating the presentation paused unexpectedly. "That is strange," he said. The room looked toward him. "What is it?" someone asked. He pointed at the screen. "These dates do not match." A few relatives stood to look more closely. I remained seated, watching. The document displayed an ownership transfer connected to the lakeside parcel Patricia had mentioned the previous day. Beside it appeared a county filing date. The two records differed by nearly 11 months. The room immediately filled with quiet conversation. People were not alarmed. They were curious. Yet I noticed Jennifer become visibly uncomfortable. She crossed her arms and stared at the floor. Daniel glanced toward her. "Do you know anything about this?" he asked casually. Jennifer answered without looking up. "Not really." Once again, her response felt rehearsed. Before anyone could continue discussing the discrepancy, another voice entered the conversation. It belonged to my older cousin Eleanor, a woman known for having an extraordinary memory. At 81 years old, she could recall details most people had forgotten decades earlier. "I remember those papers," Eleanor said. The room immediately quieted. "You do?" Patricia asked. Eleanor nodded. "Robert talked to me about them shortly before he passed." My heart skipped slightly. Nobody had mentioned Robert's name in relation to these documents before. Eleanor continued. "He was worried because some things had not been finalized." The room became very still. Daniel frowned. "What things?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "Ownership documents. Beneficiary information. That sort of thing." Several people exchanged glances. I felt my stomach tighten. Because according to everything I had been told after Robert's death, those matters had been completed smoothly. There had never been any discussion of unfinished paperwork. Daniel looked toward me. "Mom, were you aware of that?"
No, iyan suara tunasli.
The confusion on his face deepened. Then something unexpected happened. Jennifer stood up. I think people are making assumptions based on incomplete information. Her voice remained polite, but there was a sharpness beneath it that had not been there before. Eleanor looked surprised. I am only repeating what Robert told me. Jennifer forced a smile. Of course. Then she quickly added, memories can be unreliable after so many years. The comment seemed harmless, yet several people visibly reacted. Not because Jennifer had been rude, because Eleanor's memory was legendary within the family. Questioning it felt unusual. The presentation eventually continued, but nobody seemed fully focused anymore. Questions lingered. Conversations resumed in smaller groups afterward. Everywhere I went, I heard pieces of the same discussion. Dates, documents, property transfers, missing details. Nobody was accusing anyone of wrongdoing. Not yet. But curiosity had begun replacing trust. Later that afternoon, while walking near the lakeshore, Daniel caught up with me. His expression looked troubled. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. He hesitated before speaking. After Dad passed away, did you personally review all the estate paperwork? The question surprised me. No. I explained that during that difficult period, I had relied heavily on professionals and family assistants. Daniel listened carefully. So you never saw every document yourself? No. The silence that followed felt significant. Finally, Daniel looked toward the water and quietly said something that made my heart sink. Then maybe there are things neither of us knows. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Across the lake, children laughed and played. Families gathered for photographs. The reunion continued around us exactly as it had all weekend. Yet for the first time, I realized the secret everyone was slowly circling might not be hidden in distant history. It might be buried inside documents that should have been reviewed years ago. And if that was true, then someone in our family already knew the answers we were all searching for. The breakthrough came the following morning, and it arrived in the form of something so ordinary that nobody paid attention to it at first. The reunion was entering its final day. Families were beginning to pack vehicles, exchange phone numbers, and take last-minute photographs. The atmosphere remained warm on the surface, yet the questions surrounding the property records had not disappeared. If anything, they had grown stronger. Everywhere I went, relatives seemed to be discussing the same topic. Nobody was accusing anyone of wrongdoing. People simply wanted answers. I was helping fold tablecloths inside the lodge when Rebecca hurried through the doorway carrying a worn cardboard box. Her expression immediately caught my attention. Margaret, she said, almost out of breath, I think you should see this. Several nearby relatives looked up. See what? Patricia asked. Rebecca carefully placed the box on a table. These were found in the storage room. The box itself looked unremarkable. It contained old reunion materials, family newsletters, photo albums, and miscellaneous paperwork that had accumulated over the years. Most people would have ignored it. Then Rebecca removed a large envelope. My heart immediately skipped. It looked remarkably similar to the envelope I had seen Jennifer hide on the first day of the reunion. Rebecca opened it and carefully removed several folded documents. I was organizing materials before we leave, she explained. This was mixed in with old records. Within moments, several relatives gathered around. Daniel stepped closer. Patricia adjusted her glasses. Even Eleanor slowly approached the table. Rebecca unfolded the first document. A silence gradually settled across the room. At first, I did not understand what I was seeing. The paperwork appeared to involve county records connected to my late husband's estate. Names, dates, filing information, signatures. Legal language filled the pages. Then Patricia pointed to one section. Wait. Her voice sounded unusually tense. That date matches the filing discrepancy. Nobody spoke. Daniel leaned forward. He studied the document for several seconds before looking at another page. Then another. The confusion on his face slowly transformed into disbelief. Mom, he said quietly, have you ever seen these? I shook my head. Never. The room became even quieter. One document referenced a transfer authorization involving the lakeside parcel. Another referenced estate administration actions that had supposedly occurred months before certain official filings. None of it made immediate sense. Yet one fact became impossible to ignore. These were not copies of random records. They were detailed documents connected directly to events that happened after Robert's death. Events I had always believed were handled properly. Eleanor carefully examined one page. "This is why the dates never matched," she said. Patricia nodded slowly. Rebecca looked toward Daniel. Who would have had access to these? Nobody answered immediately. Then everyone's attention shifted toward the same empty chair. Jennifer was not in the room. The realization seemed to hit several people simultaneously. A few minutes later, she entered through the side door carrying a cup of coffee. The moment she saw the documents spread across the table, all color drained from her face. It lasted only a second, but everyone saw it. Daniel noticed too. "Jennifer," he said carefully, "have you ever seen these before?" The question hung in the air. Jennifer stared at the paperwork. Then she looked at Daniel. "Where did you find those?" Her answer immediately created another silence. Because she had not asked what the documents were. She had asked where they came from. Rebecca slowly crossed her arms. "So you recognize them?" Jennifer hesitated. The pause felt endless. "I may have seen some of them years ago." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. For the first time all weekend, it felt as though the family had reached the edge of something important. Daniel picked up one of the papers. "Then maybe you can explain why these records show information Mom was never told." Jennifer looked away. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Yet what struck me most was not fear on her face. It was guilt. Genuine guilt. The expression belonged to someone carrying a burden for a very long time. Finally, Jennifer sat down. She placed her coffee on the table and stared at the documents. Her hands trembled slightly. Around us, conversations throughout the lodge gradually faded. Family members sensed something significant was happening. Nobody wanted to leave. Nobody wanted to interrupt. For years, a piece of family history had remained buried beneath paperwork, assumptions, and silence. Now the evidence sat openly in front of everyone. And judging by the look on Jennifer's face, she knew exactly why. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Jennifer sat down. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have. Around the table stood family members who had spent years trusting one another. Now everyone sensed they were standing at the edge of a truth that had been hidden for a very long time. Daniel remained beside the documents, his eyes moving between the papers and his wife. "Jennifer," he said carefully, "please tell us what is going on." His voice was calm, but the concern behind it was impossible to miss. Jennifer lowered her eyes toward the table. For the first time all weekend she looked exhausted. Not nervous. Not defensive. Simply exhausted. As though carrying a secret had finally become too heavy. She folded her hands together and took a slow breath. "I never wanted this to happen like this," she said quietly. Nobody interrupted. Patricia pulled out a chair and sat down. Eleanor remained standing with one hand resting on the table. Rebecca crossed her arms and waited. I stayed silent because I sensed something important was finally about to emerge. Jennifer looked directly at me. "Margaret, I need you to understand something before anyone jumps to conclusions." I nodded without speaking. She swallowed hard. "After Robert passed away, there was a lot of confusion. The mention of my husband's name immediately captured everyone's attention." Jennifer continued. "Lawyers were involved. Financial advisors were involved. Family members were grieving. Everything happened very quickly." Daniel frowned. "What does that have to do with these documents?" Jennifer looked toward the paperwork. "Because those documents were part of a problem that was never fully resolved." The room grew completely still. She explained that shortly after Robert's death, questions had surfaced regarding several estate records. Most of the paperwork had been completed correctly, but a small group of documents contained conflicting information. Different versions existed. Some records reflected one filing date while others reflected another. The discrepancies involved ownership transfers and administrative authorizations connected to family property. "Why was none of this ever discussed?" Patricia asked. Jennifer hesitated. "Because everyone believed it had already been fixed." Daniel looked confused. "Everyone?" Jennifer nodded slowly. "At least that is what I was told." The statement immediately raised new questions. Rebecca leaned forward. Who told you? Jennifer looked down again. For several moments she seemed reluctant to answer. Finally she said, the attorney handling part of the estate process. Several relatives exchanged surprised glances. This was not the explanation anyone expected. We had spent days assuming the secret involved intentional deception inside the family. Instead, Jennifer was describing administrative confusion that had apparently spiraled into years of misunderstanding. Yet something still felt incomplete. Daniel seemed to sense it too. If this was only paperwork confusion, he said, why have you been acting so nervous all weekend? Jennifer closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they were filled with regret. Because I knew about the discrepancies years ago. That statement changed everything. Nobody spoke. Jennifer continued before anyone could interrupt. I found out shortly after Robert passed away. I was told professionals were resolving the issue. I believed it was being handled. But over time I realized some of the corrections never happened. My stomach tightened. And you never told me? I asked softly. Jennifer's eyes immediately filled with emotion. No. The answer hurt more than I expected. Not because money or property mattered. Because trust mattered. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. You knew Mom might not have all the information? Jennifer nodded. I was afraid. The room remained silent. Afraid of what? Eleanor asked gently. Jennifer took another deep breath. Afraid of creating more pain. Afraid of reopening old wounds after Robert died. Afraid that if I brought it up years later, everyone would think I had hidden it intentionally. No one responded immediately because there was truth in what she was saying. Time has a way of turning small mistakes into larger ones. The longer people wait to address a problem, the harder it becomes to explain their silence. Jennifer looked around the room. Every year that passed made it feel more impossible to talk about. Daniel sat down heavily. Rebecca's expression softened slightly. Even Patricia appeared less certain of her earlier suspicions. Yet one fact remained unchanged. Jennifer had known something important for years and had never shared it. The documents on the table proved that. The secret was no longer hidden behind missing records or conflicting dates. We finally understood why Jennifer had been so anxious all weekend. But as the realization settled over the room, another question began forming in everyone's mind. If she had known about the discrepancies for years, exactly how significant were they? Because the more we examined the documents, the clearer it became that the story was still not complete. And before this reunion ended, the final piece of the truth would have to be revealed. The room remained completely silent after Jennifer admitted she had known about the discrepancies for years. No one seemed angry. Not yet. What everyone felt was something more unsettling. Uncertainty. For days we had been chasing fragments of information, trying to understand why so many records and memories failed to match. Now we finally knew that someone had been carrying part of the answer all along. Daniel sat with his hands folded, staring at the documents spread across the table. I could see him struggling to reconcile two realities. The first was the wife he had trusted for years. The second was the woman who had just admitted she kept an important secret from our family. Jennifer looked exhausted. She no longer appeared defensive. In fact, she looked relieved. As though finally speaking the truth had removed a burden she had carried for far too long. Eleanor gently pulled a chair closer and sat down. Jennifer, she said softly, if there is more to this story, now is the time to tell it. Several relatives nodded in agreement. Nobody wanted accusations. They wanted clarity. Jennifer glanced toward me before taking a deep breath. There is something else you all need to know. The tension immediately returned. Daniel lifted his eyes toward her. Patricia leaned forward. Rebecca stopped shuffling the paperwork. Jennifer reached into her purse and removed a folded envelope. The same envelope I had seen her hide during the first day of the reunion. The sight of it immediately captured everyone's attention. Slowly, she placed it on the table. This is why I was so nervous, she said. I found this years ago. Daniel looked at the envelope. What is it? Jennifer hesitated before answering. A letter. Nobody spoke. She carefully unfolded the document inside and slid it across the table toward me. Robert wrote it. My heart nearly stopped. For a moment I could not move. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to my husband. The room seemed to disappear around me. All I could see was the familiar script covering the page. Daniel looked stunned. Dad wrote that. Jennifer nodded. A few weeks before he passed away. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the letter. The date confirmed what she had said. Robert had written it shortly before his death. I began reading silently. Within moments, tears filled my eyes. The letter was not a legal document. It was not a will. It contained no instructions about money or property. Instead, it was deeply personal. Robert had written about family, about mistakes, about regrets, about his hope that everyone would remain united after he was gone. Then I reached the paragraph that explained everything. Robert described concerns regarding unfinished estate matters. He acknowledged that certain records might require additional review. More importantly, he specifically requested that any future issues be handled with transparency and honesty. He did not want confusion to divide the family. He wanted openness, trust, communication. I slowly lowered the letter. The room remained silent. Jennifer's eyes were fixed on the table. I found that letter while organizing old files, she said quietly. After I discovered the record discrepancies. Daniel frowned. Then why did you hide it? Jennifer looked devastated. Because I was ashamed. Nobody interrupted. She continued. At first, I thought the paperwork issues would be corrected quickly. Then years passed. Every time I considered bringing it up, I felt guilty for waiting so long. Tears formed in her eyes. Eventually, I convinced myself that staying silent was protecting everyone. Rebecca shook her head gently. But it was hurting everyone. Jennifer nodded. I know. For the first time since the reunion began, the entire truth stood exposed before the family. The secret was never about stealing property. It was never about personal gain. Jennifer had not hidden documents to benefit herself. Instead, she had concealed information because she feared the consequences of revealing it. Her silence had been driven by fear, guilt, and avoidance. Yet despite her intentions, the result was the same. Important information had remained hidden from the people who deserved to know. Daniel looked exhausted. Patricia looked disappointed. Eleanor looked saddened. As for me, I felt something unexpected. Relief. The uncertainty that had haunted the reunion was finally gone. We now understood what happened and why. The secret that had quietly shaped years of family history no longer lived in shadows. It sat openly on the table beside Robert's letter. Around us, family members gathered closer. Nobody rushed to judgment. Nobody raised their voice. Because the moment was bigger than blame. It was about truth. And after years of silence, that truth finally belonged to everyone. After the letter had been read and the initial shock began to settle, the atmosphere inside the lodge changed in a way I had not expected. The tension that had dominated the reunion for days slowly gave way to something else. Understanding. Not complete understanding. Not immediate forgiveness. But understanding. For the first time, everyone was looking at the same truth instead of different pieces of a puzzle. Jennifer remained seated at the table, her eyes fixed on Robert's letter. Daniel sat beside her, still processing everything he had learned. Around us, relatives quietly discussed the situation. Nobody seemed interested in assigning blame anymore. The facts had become clearer. The secret was not a scheme. It was not a deliberate attempt to take something from the family. It was the result of fear, avoidance, and years of silence. Yet one important question remained unanswered. Why had Jennifer allowed that silence to continue for so long? Eventually, Patricia asked the question everyone was thinking. Jennifer, what made you keep carrying this by yourself? Jennifer stared at her hands for several moments before answering. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. Because I thought I could fix it. The room became quiet again. She explained that when she first discovered the inconsistencies, she believed they were minor administrative issues that would eventually be corrected through professional channels. At the time, she had been helping organize family paperwork, while Daniel focused on supporting me through my grief. Jennifer said she never intended to become responsible for the situation. She simply found herself in the middle of it. Then months became years. The correction she expected never fully happened. The questions never completely disappeared. Yet every year that passed made the conversation more difficult. I kept telling myself I would bring it up next month, she admitted. Then next year. Then after the holidays. Then after another family event. Daniel slowly shook his head. And eventually it became too big. Jennifer nodded. Exactly. Her answer resonated more than I wanted to admit. Most people imagine secrets begin with bad intentions. Sometimes they do. But sometimes they begin with hesitation. One delayed conversation becomes another. One uncomfortable truth becomes easier to postpone than confront. Before long, years pass. Eleanor leaned forward and gently placed her hand over Jennifer's. Fear has a way of growing when it is fed by silence. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. I know. I listened quietly as the pieces finally came together. For days, I had wondered whether Jennifer's behavior came from selfishness. Now I could see something very different. She had spent years carrying guilt because she believed she had failed the family. Every time she saw me, she remembered the conversation she never had. Every family gathering became a reminder. Every discussion about Robert reopened the same wound. The reunion had not created her anxiety. It had exposed it. Rebecca glanced toward me. Margaret, what are you thinking? The question caught me off guard. I looked around the table at the faces of people I had known most of my life. Then I looked at Robert's letter once more. His words about honesty and unity suddenly felt more important than ever. I think Robert would have hated what happened, I said honestly. Several people nodded. Not because of the paperwork. Because of the silence. Nobody disagreed. The real damage had never been hidden in legal documents. It had lived inside years of assumptions and unspoken fears. Daniel took a deep breath and looked at his wife. You should have told us. Jennifer nodded immediately. I know. There was no argument. No excuses. No attempts to justify her choices. Only regret. In some ways that made the moment easier. For the first time all weekend, nobody seemed interested in defending a position. Everyone simply wanted to move forward. The remaining hours of the reunion became surprisingly calm. Relatives reviewed the documents together. Notes were compared. Questions were answered. Several family members agreed to consult professionals after returning home, so every remaining discrepancy could finally be resolved properly. The practical problems suddenly seemed manageable now that the truth was no longer hidden. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the lodge windows, I found myself feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because everything had been fixed. It had not. Trust would take time to rebuild. Conversations would still need to happen. But the uncertainty was gone. The secret that had quietly lingered beneath our family for years no longer controlled us. For the first time since the reunion began, I looked around the room and saw something that had been missing all weekend. Not perfection. Not agreement. Something better. Honesty. And sometimes honesty is the first step toward healing. The reunion officially ended the next morning. Vehicles filled the parking area as families loaded suitcases, folded chairs and coolers into trunks. Children hugged cousins they might not see again for years. Adults exchanged promises to stay in touch more often. On the surface, it looked like every family gathering that had come before it. Yet everyone knew this one would be remembered differently. Not because of the photographs we took or the meals we shared. It would be remembered because the truth finally came into the open. I stood near the edge of the lake one last time before leaving. The water was calm. The same sunlight that had greeted us on the first day reflected across the surface. So much had changed in only a few days. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Jennifer approaching. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence felt very different now. It no longer carried suspicion. It carried honesty. Jennifer stopped a few feet away. Her eyes looked tired, but there was also relief in them. Margaret, she said quietly, I owe you another apology. I looked at her without speaking. Not for the paperwork, she continued. For the years I spent avoiding the conversation I should have had with you. The sincerity in her voice was impossible to miss. I thought about everything that had happened. The hidden documents. The unanswered questions. The fear she had carried for years. Most of all, I thought about Robert's letter. He had hoped our family would remain united through honesty. Somehow, despite all the mistakes that followed, his words had finally brought us back to that path. "I wish you had told me sooner," I said honestly. Jennifer nodded. "So do I." There was no argument. No attempt to defend herself. Just acceptance. Sometimes the most meaningful apologies are the ones that ask for nothing in return. We stood quietly beside the lake for several moments. Then I surprised myself by placing a hand on her shoulder. "The important thing is that it is out in the open now." Tears immediately filled her eyes. "Thank you." A little later, Daniel joined us. The three of us talked longer than we had in years. Not about documents or legal records. About family. About Robert. About the future. For the first time, there were no subjects being avoided. No uncomfortable truths hiding beneath the surface. The conversation felt lighter because honesty no longer had to fight for space. Before everyone left, the family gathered for one final photograph. Nearly 60. Relatives stood together near the shoreline. Children sat cross-legged in the front row while older family members occupied folding chairs. As the photographer prepared the shot, I looked around at the faces surrounding me. Some were laughing. Some were still emotional from everything that had happened. Yet there was a feeling of closeness that had been missing earlier in the week. Secrets create distance. Truth creates connection. The camera captured the moment. A simple photograph. Yet I knew it represented something far more important than a family reunion. It represented a family choosing transparency over silence. Weeks later, after everyone returned home, the remaining paperwork questions were finally addressed properly. Professionals reviewed the records. Corrections were made where necessary. The practical issues that had seemed so intimidating turned out to be manageable once people worked together openly. More importantly, relationships began healing. Trust was not restored overnight. Trust rarely works that way. But it was rebuilt through conversations, honesty, and consistency. Jennifer remained committed to making things right. Daniel stayed involved throughout the process. And I learned something unexpected about myself. For years, I had believed that protecting family meant avoiding difficult conversations. Now I understood that real protection comes from facing them. Looking back, the most valuable thing discovered during that reunion was not hidden inside an envelope or buried within old documents. It was the reminder that families are strongest when truth has room to exist. Robert understood that long before any of us did. In the end, the secret that had remained hidden for years did not destroy our family. The silence surrounding it nearly did. But once the truth emerged, it gave us an opportunity we never would have had otherwise. A chance to rebuild. A chance to heal. A chance to become the family Robert always hoped we would be. And as I look at that final reunion photograph today, that is what I remember most. Not the secret itself. The moment we finally stopped hiding from it together.